Hello, colleagues. For me, academia has been an ivory tower. I'm one of those first in the family to attend university. I come from a lower socioeconomic status family. My mother did not graduate from high school. My father was a hard-working mechanic. I hated schooling while I was in high school. I was a rebellious teenager. I had a lot of freedom. However, I had the importance of education pushed by my parents. My parents used to tell me things like, there's no parenting manual. And, um, and now that I'm older, I kind of question that, but I believed it back then. I say this so you can understand my context. My bias, my paradigm. I'm a white, straight male from a European background that obsessed with education as a tool for social mobility. It has not been created this way. The American education system, Canadian education system, is based off of the Prussian model. During my undergrad, I learned from Paulo Freire, and I met and listened to John Taylor Gatto in person. And these educators all argued that the politics and education are intertwined. They're the same thing. That education's um, a little mini version of our society. So, academic reading and writing is the same thing. So, like Lathers argues that academic scholars they embrace labels, boxes, biases. She describes them as hegemonic paradigms. As Doreen Stark Mehring writes, the scholars are all struggling to understand these weird unspoken rules in discourse communities, and we all need to follow these things. We're expected to follow, memorize seemingly like arbitrary APA rules that require centering on the title page, 1-inch margins. Why? What is the reason for these explicit rules and norms? Is it arrogant to source yourself? Should your PhD or master's degree come from the same university as your undergraduate? I've heard it shouldn't. These are things that are frowned upon, but I've never seen it written down somewhere. There is a whole political and social status behind so much of academia. The jibber jabber, the language of bullshit, the clabber blabbering, the use of acronyms and buzzwords until no one knows what you're talking about. If you hand the Quebec education program to a parent and student teacher, no one can understand what you're talking about. The learning is not written in a clear and visible manner, but what's my point? Where am I going with this? Academic reading and writing is full of bullshit, full of cultural norms and expectations that seem arbitrary. But that doesn't mean there isn't value. I tell my students the education system is not perfect. I'm not a perfect teacher. We're not a perfect school, but we have good intentions, as does academia. The progressional learning I've had during this class has led me to believing that learning academic reading and writing is essential. Knowing how to read the research, to understand, to write, summarize, and explain the research, these things lead us to informing practice, to improving society, to improving the frontline teaching, to have um, research-based practice. Schooling has changed slowly. My school board sends me to trainings where I hear about John Hattie's visible learning or Richard DeFore's push for professional learning communities. So many educators have heard of John Dewey, Harry Wong, Alfie Kohn. Their opinions or research have influenced practice throughout the education system. But for me, I daily hear the words, the research says, without citation or reference, so many times, without summarization, without explanations, just like, the experts say this, the research says this is why we are doing this. I do the same. I tell the students, research says your memory is improved if you write the notes out by hand. I still accommodate and let kids write and take pictures instead of writing by hand, but still, so many teaching practices, changes, policies, thoughts rely on trusting the words of those in power. School board people, the principal, whoever consultants. But for me, does the research actually say that? Do I have the academic reading ability to check? Do I know? Have I researched this? Are they bullshitting me? Can I trust them? As for writing, academic writing, I kind of think back to the Cree First Nations resistance to the James Bay hydroelectric dam. I know this might be a confusing leap, but in 1991, Matthew Coon Combe, Coon Com, oh man. Anyways, sorry. They used the cultural discourse imposed on him and the other leaders from residential schools. They were forced to go into schools. They were pulled out of their family, but they used the knowledge, the language, and the skills that they learned in school to fight for their people's rights in New York City. They went on the media. He articulated a whole campaign using the media against the Quebec government to get rights. So Chief Matthew Kuncombe took abuse verbally, sexually during his time in residential schools, but he kept his cultural values, beliefs, language, and identity. But he was able to turn around that hegemonic discourse of Canada. He was able to turn that skill and that understanding of culture to successfully challenge the oppression of power. So that's what I'm kind of looking at, academic writing. Okay. So these are the skills needed for me to develop my challenge to power, to the status quo. The education system wasn't, it wasn't created for all kids to be successful or to pull kids out of poverty. It was created to stratify our society, create worker bees, and was based off the Prussian model to perpetuate inequality. So subversive academics have fueled this change, though. Nowadays, the pendulum of education has flown back and forth as educators have built and fixed the plane in the middle of flight. So, the academic researchers have been creating different thoughts, different influences on how teachers are doing things in classrooms for, the last 50 years or so. And nowadays we have access to more research, more understanding about how schools should function to have more people be successful than ever. So how can educators enact change? How can the schooling enable social mobility? With these things, take academic reading and writing skills. If I don't know how to academically read, I can be misled, manipulated. I just have to believe people on face value. Without academic writing skills, and then I can't practice in front of the front. I can't communicate with academia as a frontline educator. I can't practice action research. You end up, the education system, the teachers in schools just become subservient to the elite of researchers who are just pushing ideas from the ivory tower into the school board to the principals, and then it pushes down in the classrooms. But without that back and forth and that communication between educators who should be professionals in Quebec, because we have no. Anyways, so we'll move on from there. So because in the eloquent words of George W. Bush, rarely is the question asked, "Is our children learning?" We need to figure out what's happening in the classroom and then connect that to the academic reading and writing. And without it, there's no success.